For many of us in the UK, the closest we get to seeing the US women's national team players in the flesh is when there is an international tournament in Europe.
Mewis, Lavelle, Rose up the middle, looking, cutting, shooting, go! Lavelle to another US!
This is about to change though.
Some big news, not just in the NWSL world, but the women's soccer world. Sam Mewis of the North Carolina Courage has been signed by Manchester City. Rose Lavelle of the Washington Spirit also linked with City. This is big news, isn't it?
With the news that Sam Mewis and Rose Lavelle are joining Manchester City, and Tobin, Heath and Christen could be joining Manchester United, the US women's national team now feels much less distant.
The WSL, I've heard really good things from some of my teammates on the national team who've played here before, so I'm just really excited, and I think that Man City is such a cool place to get to experience it.
This seems like a good time to go over and be with a great club, be in a great training environment, and play a lot of competitive games.
In this episode, we ask, why are American players migrating to the United Kingdom? And what impact will it have on the English game?
What's happening with a lot of the leagues, it's actually beginning to look a lot like the men's game, and there are real kind of haves and have-nots.
Tim Stillman writes about Arsenal and Arsenal women for arseblog and talks about Arsenal on the Arsenal Vision podcast.
I think you could just as easily argue that Spain is the place to be. They have some really good teams. France as well have Lyon and PSG. Germany have Wolfsburg and Bayern. There's quite a lot of leagues that have these really good elite teams and then not much going on underneath. To be honest, I do think the WSL is a little bit like that. What I think gives the WSL the edge is that there are 3 elite teams. Manchester United, I think, will join that band in the next couple of years, and maybe some of those teams in the middle are slightly better than the teams in the middle of the other European leagues, but I'd say that tentatively Europe is the place to be for the women's game at the moment.
The Women's Super League is obviously one of the best in the world. Man City, of course, one of the top clubs in the world. And for someone like Rose Lavelle, it's a top-notch club that will take care of her in terms of injuries. We know that's always been an issue for Rose Lavelle. And for Sam Mewis, it's a place for her to learn and grow. And so I think it's healthy.
So let's start with the big news of the last few weeks. Sam Mewis and Rose Lavelle have both signed for Manchester City. How big a coup for Manchester City is this?
Yeah, very big, very big. It's rare to get US women's national team players to England because of the way, their national team is all dominant, and their national team really stops players from going abroad other than in non-tournament years. And so they've taken a bit of an opportunity, and they've got both players for 1 year. Rose Lavelle is an extraordinary player, but she's got a really checkered injury history, and that's going to be quite interesting to see how she copes with the physical side.
Press. Got one already. Cuts it back on a dime. Squares it to the penalty spot. Mewis! Puts it in. It's 4-0.
Sam Mewis is a star. She's a really, really good player. And City are a team with like a good spread of good players, but I don't think they've had that star player for a little while, like a Vivian Miedema or a Sam Kerr. That's kind of not what they've quite had. And Sam Mewis in particular, I think, pushes the needle for them a little bit more there.
How surprised were you when this news broke of these 2 players moving to City?
I wasn't enormously surprised because of the situation with coronavirus in the States, and because there's no certainty on whether there will be any sort of NWSL, that's the American women's top flight this year, and with the Olympics next summer. I knew that some, potentially quite big American players were going to come over. I wasn't necessarily sure that would translate into Rose Lavelle and Sam Mewis coming to Manchester City, but I was quite surprised, actually. I think what's interesting is that Arsenal and Chelsea haven't gone into that market because I think their respective managers have real long-term squad planning and aren't fans of opportunistic signings. So what Manchester City have done is they've taken an opportunity to make exciting but quite short-term star signings, and it'll be really interesting to see how that works for them.
Christen Press and Tobin Heath, very close to a deal that would take them to Manchester United. I was shocked when I saw this.
The other exciting news in the Women's Super League was that Tobin Heath and Christen Press were in talks with Manchester United over possible transfers. Do you have any updates on this story?
None compared to what's in the press at the moment, other than the moves that are all but agreed. That's the really surprising one for me.
That's Caitlin Ford to Tobin Heath. Back heels it in for the goal. That is sweet. Sixth sense by Heath to kick it in with her back turned the net. We had a 2-2.
Tobin Heath is another absolute bona fide star, as is Christen Press, and I think we've all known Manchester United have decided to build quite slowly with an eye on the top three. They knew, for example, last season they weren't really going to challenge the top three other than in one-off games, and I don't think they really expected to this season either, but we've known it's in the post that they're going to start enlisting real star players, and again, this is an opportunistic signing. They'll only get them basically on loan for a year, but these are two players that really push the quality of that Manchester United squad up. This is a really surprising signing, and particularly Tobin Heath, who happens to be a big Arsenal fan. I would have expected her to go somewhere like Manchester City, Arsenal or Chelsea.
Which would you say is more significant, Manchester City signing Mewis and Lavelle, or Manchester United approaching Heath and Press?
I think the latter, United getting Heath and Press. Lavelle and Mewis, I think they're slightly better than the quality of player City have in general. Not much, but slightly. But, Manchester City are a top team and have been for some time. The United one, I think that's more significant. That, to me, looks a bit like a statement from Manchester United to say, actually, we might start throwing the money around a little bit sooner than anticipated. And for those players to come to a club who don't have a realistic chance yet of winning the WSL, there's 3 Champions League places this year, so United would consider themselves an outsider for 3rd place in Champions League qualification. And this certainly brings them closer to that conversation.
And Manchester United are a relatively recent entrant to the Women's Super League stage. Is this sort of cross-city rivalry what the Women's Super League needs to make the next step in its progression?
I think this is a really interesting question because it plays into, and you see this at individual club level, how do we market and how do we grow the women's game? Do we borrow those rivalries from the men's? And this goes for Arsenal and Tottenham as well. And there was some debate last year because Arsenal and Tottenham played one another in the league for the first ever time in the women's game, because they've always been a few divisions apart. So is that really a rivalry in the women's game when they've played each other so seldom and the squads happily trade players? So in the women's game, for example, United and City, Arsenal and Tottenham, these aren't really rivalries, they're borrowed from the men's game. But from a marketing perspective, you could say to generate that interest and to bring that interest over from the men's game, is it worth borrowing those rivalries and kind of pretending that they're a thing when they're not really? And like I say, you see this at individual club level as well. So for example, Manchester City really strongly espouse this one club kind of philosophy in their marketing. They mix the Twitter feeds up and everything like that. Whereas a club like Arsenal, and I've spoken to Arsenal about this, Arsenal deliberately, they still have the one club thing, but they market the teams quite separately because their view is the women's team are very storied, very successful, and they are a brand in their own right. And so they consider them part of the Arsenal family, but separate in a good way, separate not in a Liverpool forgotten way, separate in a, no, we believe in you as a unique brand. And I think that that's a really core debate about how we grow the interest in the women's game. Do we sell it on its actual merits and its realities, or do we borrow some of those things from the men's game to kind of generate that interest?
Why do you think we're seeing a potential influx of Americans into English football at this point in time?
So there's a simple answer to this one. It's because of coronavirus in the States.
Well, I think there's a lot to blame on this pandemic and the way this country has handled the pandemic. No NWSL season, no US games in sight, and no real handle on COVID-19 here in the United States.
At the moment, it doesn't look like there's going to be an NWSL season at all. They played a short kind of one-off playoff tournament to keep things ticking over, but at the moment, with the situation with coronavirus in the States, they can't organise a league at the moment, whereas European leagues and the WSL can, and they can promise, or at least notionally promise, depending on what happens, a league season, and particularly in the build up to the Olympics. That's very, very important. Otherwise, a lot of these players are looking at potentially a year with no competition and then the Olympics, and that's why you've got this unique situation where American players are coming over.
We need to talk a little bit about the structures of US soccer at this point as well, because I think it's fair to say that the US soccer scene is dominated by the national team, and domestic teams come secondary to those commitments to the national team. Why might this have affected players coming to the UK in the past?
It's again quite straightforward in that they're effectively told not to by the US Soccer Federation. So we've had some US women's national team players come to Europe before, but only for one season, sometimes less, and in the non-tournament years. So Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan had short spells at Lyon. We had Carly Lloyd, played for Manchester City for a season.
Sensibly to Megan Campbell. It's a lovely delivery to the back stick, and it's 3, and it's Carly Lloyd, a Wembley goal scorer again.
Crystal Dunn played for Chelsea for a season, but this was the non-tournament year, and in the women's cycle, basically 3 of every 4 years is a tournament year because of the Olympics. So, you know, you'll have a continental, then a World Cup, then the Olympics, and then there's 1 year spare. So basically the US women's national team players are told to stay in the States. Also, their training camps are quite long. They tend to keep the players for a few weeks for a training camp, so it's not like you have in Europe, fly off for a quick friendly or qualifier or 2 and come back inside a week. They stay together for a few weeks, and that's not favourable for European teams to lose their players for that long, whereas in the US it's kind of accepted that that's it, you lose the players to the national team, which takes prominence. So that's why these moves are quite unique, and that's why they're opportunistic, because they would not have happened without coronavirus. So these moves are decisions that have been made quickly to bring some of these players over, and they're only on loan for a year effectively.
Without getting too mired up in the ins and outs of it, the US women's national team players are unionised in quite a stringent way, and they sign a collective bargaining agreement as part of their commitment to the team. Is there going to be a sort of sense of leniency here with the collective bargaining agreement? Is there space within that bargaining agreement for them to be able to come to the UK then?
I would imagine so, yes, and the leniency would be there because this is beneficial for the US women's national team, for these players to come over and have a year of competition, because at the moment the alternative is they probably won't get any competition at all. Maybe they'll get another kind of one-off playoff tournament, but that won't happen anytime soon. It's very difficult for them to create a kind of bubble scenario like we've seen with the Women's Champions League. And there's still lots of clubs there for whom coronavirus is still spreading in teams. We had Orlando, for example, they had to pull out of the NWSL playoff tournament at the 11th hour because they had, I think it was 6 or 7 positive tests at the same time. Some players went to a bar, which was not sensible, and all became infected. So it's really beneficial to them on this occasion. So yes, there will be a leniency built in for that, absolutely certainly.
I want us to talk a little more generally about the context of women's football in the UK at present. How would you describe the health of the women's game in the UK?
Top heavy is how I would describe it. So your 3 elite teams, Arsenal, Manchester City and Chelsea, very, very healthy. You know, big wage bills, players are looked after, paid well. You can put Manchester United and Everton in the bracket below that, and Everton are worth talking about. They've been spending some money over the last year or two. They just paid £100,000 for a player this summer, which is really rare. It's really rare to have any sort of transfer fee in the women's game, but £100,000 is a lot of money to spend on a player. So I think Everton are a team you can look at who are coming into that it's a good place to be for a player. And there are some clubs who really deserve some credit, like Reading, even Birmingham, who look like they're in for a difficult season, but given the relative resource of the club, they put a lot into their women's team. Below that, I don't think it is that healthy, to be honest. Still, I think we're definitely building from the top up, maybe trickle-down economics, the famed Thatcher trickle-down economics, which were a roaring success, obviously, in the 80s, because that's how things work. And so that's where the questions really lie. And you get these weird scenarios, like Aston Villa were promoted from the Championship to the WSL. But they haven't held on to all of their players because there's this odd scenario where in the Championship they're part-time, and so they play football part-time and they'll have a full-time job, and that will probably pay them more than being a low-end WSL club. And there are quite a lot of players who choose to stay in the Championship so that they can keep their much more secure day jobs rather than coming into the WSL, and that's a real pinch point. Some of these Championship clubs, and even below that, I would say not that healthy. That's going to take time, obviously, but I think what we've seen in the last few years is there's been a real push at the elite end, and that's reflected through European football as well.
How important do you think the next few seasons are going to be for the future of the English game?
Pivotal, absolutely pivotal, mainly due to coronavirus. I would say that actually they haven't got everything right, but I think the English FA actually deserve quite a lot of credit for how the women's game has come on here, for the international team they've put together. They didn't hire the right person to manage it on this occasion, but they do actually have a really good national team. The WSL is getting so much better, it really is. It's still probably a bit top heavy, but I really do think the FA have put their money where their mouth is, and as much as we can complain about the flaws, I think there have been a lot of good things that have happened over the last few years. But I think coronavirus has put a real question mark against some of this, and there are some players, high profile players like Leah Williamson, for example, who said, women's football has been forgotten about through coronavirus, and the league was suspended, end of February for the women, and it's not coming back till September, so that's a 6-month pause without any sort of women's football, while the priority was getting the Premier League going and some elements of the Football League going, and that kind of TLC wasn't really applied to the women's game. How some of these clubs fare on the other side of this, particularly as the top teams pull away. A club like Birmingham or Reading might start looking at this and thinking, what is the point in us investing in this anymore when we can't really expect to do very much here? There could be a bit of an existential crisis caused by the economic impact of COVID.
She likes to play football. She likes to play through the thirds. It's nice to watch. But what's impressed me is that tactically she's quite flexible, so she can change the way that they play. And that's what I was going to...
You've mentioned the English national team. It's just been announced that Sarina Weigman will be the England manager. What impact will this move make on the attractiveness of the WSL, do you think?
I'm not sure it will have a huge impact on that, not least because a lot of the Dutch players that Sarina managed are over here already and playing in the WSL. Their biggest players like Vivian Miedema, Danielle van der Donk, and Shanice van der Sanden played for Liverpool before she moved to Lyon. So I think in that respect, what you're seeing with the WSL is it's very quickly become much more international, whereas 4 or 5 years ago, it's rare to have more than one foreign player in your team. Now you're looking at, much more like the Premier League. It's becoming much more globalised, particularly at the European level, but we're getting Canadians, Australians, players from New Zealand and all over the world really coming into the league. I think Sarina Weigman's impact is much more on the national team in terms of her tournament experience with Netherlands. England will be among the favourites for each tournament they're in, and they've just failed to make those big games work for them. And Sarina, personally, I don't think she's an amazing coach myself, but you can't argue with her record in tournaments, and that's what I think England really needs. So as much as I don't think tactically, I don't think she's an amazing coach or an amazing fit, I do think she was probably the best candidate available, and I do think she's got something that the England setup probably lacks.
Barcelona it is who make the last four. Atletico beaten. Last season's runners-up will continue their attempt to go one better this time, and it was the French international, the vastly experienced Amraoui, with the only goal of the game.
And of course the Champions League is ongoing at the moment. There were 2 clubs from Spain, Germany and France in the Champions League quarter-finals, and only 1 club from England. Does that suggest that England is the 4th best league, and if so, how far behind the other leagues are they?
I don't think so. I think they're all quite similar. Manchester City were knocked out by Atletico Madrid, which was actually a big surprise in the round of 32, and that's 2 years in a row that Manchester City have fallen to Atletico Madrid, and they were the favourites both times. Not by a long, long way, but they were favourites nonetheless, and that was a bit of a surprise. And Atleti are decimated for this tournament now because they had 6 players test positive for coronavirus, so they had to put out a really weak side against Barcelona. I think that they're all fairly similar. I think Lyon, PSG, Barcelona, Atleti, Arsenal, Chelsea, Manchester City, Bayern Munich, these are all teams on a very, very similar level. And so last season, Chelsea got to the semi-finals and they were pretty unfortunate to be knocked out by Lyon. The real question that's being asked within women's football is who takes Lyon's perch, because there's Lyon at the top of the tree and then there's all those clubs I've just mentioned just behind them. Probably I'd put Wolfsburg slightly above. Clubs like Arsenal, Chelsea, Barcelona, etc. They're the ones who can really challenge, I think, albeit they're losing some important players and they'll lose Pernille Harder next summer. But I think those leagues are very, very similar in that they have 2, or in England's case 3, really, really good teams. And I'm sure next season, I'm certain Chelsea will get to at least the semi-final. And I think Chelsea are a team that can challenge Lyon, particularly in a kind of one-off game.
How would you assess Manchester City's chances of rivalling Lyon? They've obviously added Mewis and Lavelle to a core of Steph Houghton, Ellen White, Demi Stokes and Karen Bardsley. Have they got the potential to rival Lyon in the near future?
I don't think so. I think in a one-off game they'd give them a really, really good game, but I just don't think they're quite of that quality. The other thing about Manchester City is they're ageing slightly. Steph is in her 30s, Ellen White's in her 30s. They lost Nikita Paris. They've only got Sam Mewis and Rose Lavelle for 1 year, so that they're going to have to do a bit of a rebuild, and it'll be interesting to see how they go about that. What Manchester City have really done is focused, and I should point out they changed manager earlier this year, so this might change, but they really focused on domestic players. They've got the core of that Lionesses squad. But like I said earlier, I think they've lacked that real star, that Miedema, Sam Kerr, Beth England type absolute bona fide match winner. Sam Mewis gives them that, I think, but she only gives it to them for 1 season. So I'd put Manchester City in that band of clubs alongside the likes of Barcelona, Atleti, PSG, probably Arsenal, probably Chelsea, who are just a bit behind, and all of those clubs are trying to catch up. But I think the gap's closing, but Lyon are still the kind of the queens of the game, as it were.
So do you think these few moves will precipitate a larger influx of Americans into the league?
So there'll be a couple more before the transfer window closes on September the 10th. But again, they'll only be for 1 year, because next year they will all go back, no doubt, because the World Cup's in 2023 and they'll start to kind of drift back. There will be a few more coming from the league, and not just American players, but you've got Rachel Daly, for example, who's in the England squad. She's been in the NWSL for years. She'll come over to England. I'm not sure which club yet, but she's going to come over on a 1-year loan deal. What's quite interesting, I think, is what happens with a lot of young English players is they get swallowed up by the US scholarship system. So you get like a talented young English player and they quite often get spirited away to the States because they have the scholarship system, and that's obviously a very attractive prospect. I can play elite football and get a really good degree somewhere. And so there are quite a lot of good young English players who are over in the US, and they're coming back now because of coronavirus. A few of them who are in their senior year, players like Lottie Wubben-Moy, who used to play for Arsenal, Alessia Russo, good young players who've been in the States and therefore off the market because they've been at college. A lot of them have decided to cut short their senior years because of coronavirus, and they're going to come back probably. And that for me is where the real interest is. The elite level US WNT players, that's temporary. That's just for 1 year, but I think some of these players who've been embedded in the college system coming back early, that for me is really interesting, because a lot of those mid-ranking clubs I think could really be smart and snap some of those players up.
Do you think this is going to have an impact on the future of the NWSL, the women's league in the US?
It could do, yes. The NWSL's got a very kind of checkered history. And again, this is where the FA deserves credit for the way they've built the WSL, because numerous professional women's leagues in America have fallen by the wayside because they've been funded by private investment, and when private investment decides it doesn't want to fund something anymore, things collapse, and that's what's happened stateside quite a few times. I don't think that's going to happen this time. In fact, the NWSL did some really, really good sponsorship deals to be able to fund this one-off playoff tournament. So a lot of the costs were covered by Budweiser, for example. They were able to pull in pretty big commercial sponsors. So I don't think anything like that's going to happen yet, but it's all completely contingent on coronavirus. If this time next year NWSL still can't get a proper league going, then I think we really are looking at, if not the collapse of the league, we're looking at players saying, well, look, I'm definitely going to Europe now because there's much more structure there and it's much more secure. And the deals with the US Soccer Federation are vulnerable at the moment because they're all kind of subject to the legal process, as Kelsey, who you've had on this show before, has explained very well. So I think it's potentially vulnerable. I don't think the league will collapse, but if the US doesn't get coronavirus under control soon, then I think we could see a much more permanent flocking of players to Europe.
So is the future of the women's game in the UK looking bright then?
I think so, yes. Pre-coronavirus, I'd have said very much so long as we start to look after some of those mid-ranking clubs, some of those championship clubs, and look after the grassroots level. I think that's the next challenge for the FA. COVID has thrown some kind of balls up into the air a little bit, but they've taken care of the elite side now, and the clubs are taking care of the elite side, and they all understand the importance from a commercial and branding respect of having competitive women's teams. So I think that's taking care of itself, and clubs like Arsenal, Chelsea, Manchester City, they will be fine on the other side of COVID. The real kind of challenge now is to look after the grassroots, to get more girls playing football, and, you know, looking at the Lionesses and continuing to bring through some of that young talent, as players like Steph Houghton and Ellen White have probably only got another tournament or two left in them. And from what I hear, that is the FA's plan, to really start to address participation. If that's done well, and I do think that's in the hands of good people, then I think the future's really bright.
You can read everything Tim Stillman writes about Arsenal women and Arsenal at arseblog, and listen to him talking about Arsenal on the Arsenal Vision podcast. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.